Hello and welcome to Top Story. It's a country with one of the worst performing economies in the world. It has an annual inflation rate racing towards 5,000% with terrifying rapidity. And the cost of living has spun so far out of control that the same amount needed to buy a banana today would have bought you a house 5 years ago. The country is Zimbabwe, once one of the richest in Africa. Things are now so bad that the UN's World Food Programme says some 3.3 million Zimbabweans face famine in the coming months. It has appealed to international donors for $118 million in emergency aid. The grim reality of life in President Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe is that unemployment has reached 80%, power cuts are an everyday occurrence, and shop shelves are bare of even the most basic of goods. Zimbabweans are fleeing the country at a rate of 3,000 a day, mostly to South Africa. President Mugabe's solution to print more money and artificially freeze prices has merely exacerbated the problem, with some now predicting that inflation will have soared to 100,000% by the end of the year. How much longer can Mugabe cling on to power? Well, to answer that question, I'm joined now from Brussels by Nick Grono, Vice President of the International Crisis Group. Thanks very much for joining us on Top Story. 4,500% at the moment inflation in Zimbabwe. That's not an abstraction of you living there. That's something quite existential, isn't it?
It's catastrophic. You know, the economy is in free fall and the numbers are just unbelievable. You've heard perhaps that Zimbabwe has just printed off a new $200,000 note because inflation is degrading the value of their money so rapidly, and it's extremely difficult for ordinary citizens to survive in those conditions.
And now this warning of famine from the United Nations World Food Programme. Yeah, how serious an issue is that going to be?
Well, it's a very serious issue. Over a third of the population needs food support, and this is in a country that used to be the breadbasket of Africa. It's just devastating to see what's going on in Zimbabwe right now.
Well, as you said, not that long ago it used to be the world's breadbasket of Africa. So why then has it come to this?
Well, because President Mugabe has pursued policies that have just absolutely devastated his country's economy. There's been the land seizures, and there have just been other economic policies that have just destroyed what was a thriving economy, and we're seeing the consequences of it now.
Robert Mugabe's answer to this is to slash prices, to force merchants and shopkeepers to cut their prices by as much as 50%, but that seems to have exacerbated the problem.
Yeah, of course. I mean, shopkeepers are now closing their shops because they can't afford to operate at a loss, and so they're being forced to open up, they're being forced to offer prices at far less than it cost them to purchase goods. So you had a very temporary glut of merchandise and products, and now the shelves are bare. And one looks at Zimbabwe and always thinks that, you know, it's reached a stage where it's about to collapse, and we've been wondering what will happen for the last few months, but it must be getting very, very close to a stage where the economy will just close down.
But if you slash prices in that way by 50%, what incentive, I suppose, is there for you to produce if you're working in agriculture?
Yeah, of course. And what you're seeing in Zimbabwe is it's essentially turning into a barter economy. I mean, when you need $200,000 notes to buy a kilo of sugar, where bread is 50 times more expensive now than it was a year ago, you don't survive by using money to exchange for goods. You know, people are just kind of reverting to growing their own produce, and you're seeing the consequences of it with the pending food crisis.
As you said, Zimbabwe has seemed to be on the verge of collapse for many, many years now. It hasn't happened. But how far, I suppose, can this go on? What's the popular mood like in the country? Is there a sense of impending revolt, or are people just simply so fatigued now that they just want to get from day to day?
Well, I think that's a very good point. I think there is a degree of fatigue and resignation, but I mean, one does have to ask at what point will people just say that things are so bad that action has to be taken. A lot of observers are quite surprised, perhaps, that Zimbabwe has been as stable as it has been, but it's also a state with very severe repression. You know, the ordinary people are suffering, but the groups around Mugabe, the military, the security services aren't, and so it's in their interest to maintain a repressive situation. And the situation will probably only really change when neighbouring states in southern Africa start pushing Mugabe much, much harder.
At what point is that going to happen? Apparently 3,000 people fleeing to South Africa from Zimbabwe every day now. The pressure must be growing on the South Africans to do something about it, but thus far they seem quite reluctant, at least publicly, to criticise Robert Mugabe.
They are, and certainly they are very unwilling to make public criticisms. We have seen some moves towards kind of real pressure for the first time, very quiet behind-the-scenes pressure from the regional community, the regional economic community in Southern Africa, which has launched a mediation process that's being headed up by South Africa's President Mbeki, which is drawing together the ZANU-PF, Mugabe's party, and the opposition MDC for talks about constitutional change and some kind of solution. But the progress so far has been very, very slow, and I think more pressure is required from southern African states to push Mugabe to accept that change is required.
There does seem to be a general reluctance on the part of African leaders to criticise Mugabe, perhaps because he sort of occupies almost an iconic role for many African leaders because of his part in achieving independence for Zimbabwe. But Kenneth Kaunda, not very long ago, former president of Zambia, said people should lay off criticising Mugabe. What's behind that?
Well, Robert Mugabe is the last of the great liberation leaders. You know, he overcame white rule in former Rhodesia, and so he has a certain status, particularly with the ANC. There is a great reluctance to criticise someone who is seen as this kind of liberation leader. But one also has to bear in mind, and Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General, came out last week and talked of a certain kind of reverse racism that exists where Africans have overthrown tyrannical white leaders but are allowing themselves to be ruled by tyrannical black leaders. And I think this is something that one hopes will resonate with leaders in southern Africa.
There's no sign whatsoever, is there, that Robert Mugabe is going to go voluntarily?
No. He is worried that if he's forced from power, he may be somehow put on trial for international crimes against humanity. He looks at what's happened to former leaders like Charles Taylor. You know, he is worried about the consequences of him stepping down from power.
What do you think, and we've spoken about South Africa and South Africa putting pressure on Mugabe, what effectively, though, can South Africa do to really make Mugabe shift?
Well, there's a number of things that can be done. I mean, until now, African leaders and Southern African leaders haven't really spoken out critically of Mugabe, and it would have an impact. You know, he's been able to survive because he can portray this as a Zimbabwe against the West kind of conflict. But if the Southern African leaders, and led by South Africa's President Mbeki, started being a bit more vocal in their criticisms, I think that would have a very significant impact.
We're going to have to end it there, I'm afraid. That's all we have time for today. Thanks to Nick Grono of the International Crisis Group. Join us again tomorrow for another edition of Top Story. Goodbye.